Welcome back to MTR 1600. What we want to begin to talk about also in this module, the previous modules talked about the atmosphere. We're going to talk about the climate, scientific method, and some other basic types of things. You just need the fundamentals heading into more of the intricacies of climate science. Like I said before, the module one overall is a pretty fundamental set of information. So, how could humans change the whole world's climate? There's all kinds of arguments out there that we're just a speck on the Earth, that kind of thing. What we have done over the last several hundred years as we've industrialized has definitely changed our climate, especially as fossil burning engines and power plants and things like that were introduced onto the globe, which helped to add billions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, we talked about a little bit, actually trap a lot of the radiation that the sun puts off. And as you increase those greenhouse gases, whether it be natural through volcanoes and things like that, or the ocean actually emitting carbon dioxide, humans adding to it with fossil fuel burning types of mechanisms, engines, plants, things like that, definitely has increased the amount of greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I talked earlier also about introduced this idea that increasing greenhouse gases actually has a kind of double barrel effect by increasing the evaporation of water. And we know now taking water from liquid to vapor actually is adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere as well. So it's kind of this 1-2 punch when you increase CO2 and methane and some of these other greenhouse gases. How hot will it get? That's a good question, and it's something we're going to discuss throughout this semester. There is uncertainty. The climate system's extremely complex. You can see all the different variables. I'm a big proponent of not only do I think the anthropogenic or human-caused CO2 issues are a problem, but I also think we need to get a handle on land use. We've urbanized a lot of areas that used to be agriculture, so changing, and we've done it in a pretty massive way in the industrialized countries like the United States, China, and other places. And changing the land, the way that we use the land, does have some subtle effects or not so subtle effects and ramifications for the climate and changes in the climate. There's differing amounts of heating in different regions. You're going to hear throughout the semester that the Arctic in the northern hemisphere actually is taking a brunt of a lot of the heating, which is not good. That's where a lot of our ice caps are. So if you start messing around with the oceans and ice caps, you're going to start dealing with changes in ocean circulation, ocean chemistry, those types of things that are going to have ramifications for ecosystems and things like that. There's also uncertainty on what we'll actually do to change what we're doing. So over the last 20 or so years, I actually have some hope, because you can look back on 20 years ago, maybe a little bit earlier, the hybrid vehicles were first introduced, and later on electric vehicles. But the hybrid vehicles have taken off over the last 20 years. So there's a really interesting example of how the free market actually has enabled for changes to occur, specifically by getting better technology that burns less fuel. I myself have 2 hybrid vehicles. I've got a hybrid Tahoe because I have 4 girls, and then I've got a smaller car that I drive around that's a hybrid also. I love the technology. It's amazing the difference in amount of fuel that is burned just by investing in those types of technologies, and they're only getting better. So I think there's all other aspects of the economy that, given a market, you're going to see technologies introduced that's going to help indirectly or directly um, the amount of greenhouse gases that we're pushing into the atmosphere. Another good example of that is I've seen technologies with regards to harnessing the emissions from coal-fired power plants, and that's starting to emerge. So if a market emerges as far as business goes, then those types of technologies will also take off. And last thing, things we want to talk about, is global warming necessarily a bad thing? If it's out of control, it definitely is. We'll talk about it this semester what the ramifications are for 3, 4, 5 degree increases in temperature over the next 70 to 100 years. It's catastrophic. Is warming in general, if it's held under wraps, necessarily a bad thing? It just depends on the use case. If we're talking about agriculture and you've got longer growing days, farmers certainly are going to welcome longer growing days as long as the amount of rain and that type of thing doesn't necessarily change or decrease. What are the impacts going to be specific to people? I'm also a big proponent. I've spent a bunch of time in Africa and the Middle East and other places. I think disproportionately non-industrialized, poverty-stricken countries, especially in Western Africa, are going to be hurt or impacted much more than the industrialized worlds. So I've talked about it with other classes along the way that I think a lot of the investment in adapting to climate change globally, I think, should go to some of these countries that we know are going to be affected. You're going to have changes in precipitation patterns in Western Africa that would be catastrophic for some of these countries and cultures. Changes to wildlife, the same type of thing. There's certain species of animals that are going to be more impacted at an earlier stage, like amphibians, than others. But it's definitely something that's being researched and looked at. How about the economy? Certainly, especially if you're talking about extreme weather events and things like that, over time, you're going to be dealing with economic types of issues, especially along coastlines, populated coastlines. The United States has a bunch of it. Europe has a bunch of them. It's going to take a fair amount of money to adapt to the potential for extreme weather and sea level rise. Which segues into the last one. Rising seas really put cities such as New York and London underwater. There's so much invested in those countries or those cities. I doubt it would put them underwater, but there definitely would be infrastructure that would need to be put in place in order to adapt if sea level rise is greater than expected. So these are impacts we're going to talk about along the way. We're going to look at evidence of climate change, then we're going to look at what's happening now, both politically, socially, scientifically, and economically, and then what are we projecting out in the future? So there's climate models and things like that we will discuss along the way. Thank you.